Good evening. Welcome to the Monday, November 26th Washougal City Council Workshop. Rose, could you call the roll for us, please?
Councilmember Boger,
Here.
Councilmember Plinsky,
Here.
Councilmember Greenlee,
Here.
Councilmember Lindsay,
Here.
Councilmember McDaniel,
Here.
Councilmember Shoemaker.
He's
Coun-
on his way.
Okay, Councilmember Freeman.
Are there any amendments to the agenda? Okay, hearing none, we are at the first opportunity in our agenda for any members of the public that would like to address council. Good evening, Harvey.
Mayor, city councilors, name is Harvey Olson, 3903 R Street. I was not prepared for comments last Monday. And then Mr. Boger made a comment that he had questions concerning the budget. I didn't have a copy of the budget at the time, so I went home, got my better half to look in the net. And she found it, and I ran copies off, all 89 pages. If I had about a half an hour, Mr. Mayor, I would love to go over page by page. There's a lot of things here, but I'm going to...
You only have about 2.5 minutes left.
I'm going to condense it down. That the $500,000 for property acquisition, it would take the property away from the tax rolls, and for $500,000 to build a parking lot in Washougal, I really think it's a little bit overboard, sir. The $95,000 from utilities revenue is the city in the charity business. I hope not. We have enough problems with the running the city with the few dollars that come in. You have, I talked with Jennifer Forsberg first part of this year about the budget coming up for 2013, and I asked her if she would please include under insurance for the individuals, what is it? Health insurance? Break it down to health insurance, FICA, or any other portion that comes that is classified as insurance. I think that would help all citizens and council members to see what the heck they're paying for. How much does health insurance cost nowadays for everybody? It's a big item. I know that the Rose over here, her health insurance for this year was over $12,000 just for the health insurance. And her salary, $52,175. And then the city administration has upped their amount from 2012 to 2013 by $45,069. Where is that money going to in the administration? I think Mr. David Scott and the mayor would certainly know, but nobody else knows, not by the figures that are here on the pages. The community development director has been off most of the year on unpaid leave. That money is where? That wasn't paid to her in salary. And is she coming back? We haven't really missed her.
Harvey, I need you to wrap up.
Well, that's about, I wish I had a lot more time because I got notes and notes and notes, Mr. Mayor. And I would like to say that your opening letter in there sounds to me, and I'm not being other than respectful when I
need you to
say
speed up.
this, it sounds like you're running for office, promising everything but not saying how it's going to be done. Thank you.
Harvey, I'm sorry that you feel that way. Just a couple quick answers for you. There is not $500,000 for a parking lot. The $95,000 for utilities is not charity, but yes, we are able to do that by state law. And your questions for Mrs. Forsberg in regards to bars reporting is not in her purview. It's certainly in the purview of the financial officers and the folks that put together the bars reporting system. So that's why you don't get it broken down any farther than you do.
Is that why every council member has?
Are there any other? Marilyn?
Are you gonna fight?
Heavens, no.
No fights, okay.
You have to have two to fight.
That's true, that's true. I'm Marilyn Tyrrell, and I live at 950 G Street. I hope you'll please pay attention to what I'm saying and take notes, because this gets a little bit tricky. Saturday night about 5:30, Teddy and I were at Crown Park, and he went roaring off and under the distance. He's 16 years old, and why he did this, I don't know, but he did. I spent the night, of course, very much concerned, and the next morning I went looking for him, and I thought that maybe the police would know more than I did, so I went to the Camas police, who were kind enough to tell me that he had been picked up and that he was over at our Humane Society. So I went down there, that would be Sunday, and Clint, who knows me, who lived across the street from me actually, would not let me have the dog. The dog was very upset, looked very depressed, but I said, Clint, you know me, I'll give you the money, whatever you want, just let me have my dog. And he said no, he couldn't do that because he'd lose his job. Well, first thing is, Teddy was wearing a yellow tag. He is chipped, and his tag said he was chipped. And what's the point in having a chip if nobody calls to tell me where he is? Had the police officer not been kind enough to look up the log, I would have spent the weekend worrying about him until I received a call from Officer Foster this morning. So my first thing is, if you don't have a scanner, then please get one, but because it isn't fair to leave me upset and worrying, and it isn't fair to the dog to leave him in a situation which is very difficult. The next thing is, when I came here to pay the bill, it was $35 for the ticket, which is understandable, but I was charged for 3 days for foster care when the dog was in actually less than 48 hours, but I had to pay for 72 hours, and I don't think that's fair. I was ready to take the dog home within 12 hours of his getting there, and the young woman at the Humane Society said that they have been trying to work with the city. These are your rules, city council rules. They've been trying to work with the city to collect payment. No, I can understand why you don't want to have cash flying around, but surely you would have accepted checks, maybe with a stamp on it immediately, or my credit card or something to get the dog out of a miserable situation and me out of stress and what I consider an unfair charge. I would have even considered 48 hours, I mean, two days foster as maybe fair, but 3 days I think is really overdoing it. And anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. I'm sorry that Teddy went running on you. There's no doubt we need to figure out how we get animals back on the weekends and after hours. I don't believe it's our policy. I think it's still an issue with the state auditors and the handling of funds back, forth, everything else, and making sure that we don't end up with something coming back on our side. I don't know that we have, Chief, I don't know that we even have a chip reader. I believe, don't we rely on the veterinarians to do that for us, who probably aren't around on Sundays?
They do have a chip reader, and occasionally, my understanding, or I was told, is they don't always, depending upon what type of chip they have, they don't always pick them up. So some, I think, are more proprietary to the reader, so.
Gotcha.
That's kind of where we had an issue not too long ago where a dog was picked up, they scanned it, they couldn't find it, and then, but the vet found it. And sometimes, I've also told they move around a little bit, so normally I think they're implanted at the base of the neck and the shoulder, and so they may miss that. So there's kind of a twofold thing. And we are trying to work with the Humane Society for that very incident, because we don't want to keep the dogs. And so we're just trying to work out the cash flow piece and hope to have some resolution to that soon.
I'm told there are 3 types of chips, so I guess you'd need 3 types of scanners.
Hopefully not, but
Well, one would think they would make one that be picked up by a basic scanner.
thank you, Marilyn. Are there any other members of the public that would like to address council? Okay, getting into the main agenda itself, we've got a couple of items under human resources. Jeanette?
Yes, thank you, Mayor, Council. First item, I'm recommending to council that the city of West Shore will join the Cowlitz-Waukiakum County Council of Governments, the medical rate stabilization pool for our Kaiser plan. The pool was established 3 years ago, grouped counties, cities, I believe some school districts together to create a larger pool and get some rate stabilization in their rate increases on an annual basis. And so I've been kind of looking from the outside, if you will, and monitoring the success of that pool. One of the, there's several benefits, but certainly a benefit is there's the wellness component to the pool, and our Kaiser participants participating as part of that pool. Right now, we just have that pretty much for our region's participants. It will allow us to maintain our plan and our plan design over time, so we won't be locked in and going into the pool and one plan, if you will, for the entire pool. Some of the other benefits would include lower administrative costs, again, being part of a larger pool. That amounts to 2.2% on an annual basis. And again, stability of our insurance increases year over year. Certainly, there could be cons in joining the pool. It could be a bad claims year. Certainly, if one of the larger members of the pool has some bad experience, and we would establish the risk associated with that. But that's not unlike what we're doing on a year-over-year basis, being rated individually. We're not locked into the pool. We could choose to withdraw from the pool. If we do join the pool, we would have to give them 180 days notice. And then if we wanted to opt back in, that would we'd have to be out 2 years before we could do that. Next Monday in front of you will be a resolution to join the Council of Governments, and also an interlocal agreement between ourselves and the Council of Governments. The recommended action would be to read the resolution by title only and post the resolution in the usual manner. Questions?
Paul?
Just curiosity, how much larger is the Cowlitz pool than the one we're in right now?
We have 18 members, employees, if you will, that are participating in our group. I believe it's 1,200 that are part of the COG, so a much larger group.
So,
And then, of course, you've got dependents that are also included.
so while I certainly appreciate your comment that if one of the larger members had some very bad experience, that the pool could end up with an increasing rate, but I would think that with 1,200 in the pool, it will be less volatile in terms of the costs will be more predictable than what we've had in a pool of 18.
Right, and that's been the experience, as I said, I've been watching the COG from the outside, and that's really been the experience of the last 3 years.
Oh, this sounds like a great improvement to me.
Other questions from council, comments? Brent?
Who are the other governments in the pool?
In the stabilization pool?
Does the Cowlitz-Waukiakum Council of Governments?
Yeah, so you've got the two things. You've got the organization in itself, but you've got the rate stabilization.
Okay.
So we would be essentially associate member of that, pay $260 to be part of the pool for the benefit of the stabilization. I can't list all of them, but certainly Longview is a member, Cowlitz County, Waukiakum County, just to name a few. But there
There's
are
no
several.
cancer hot spots up there, anything like that that we're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Okay. This is, and indulge me a little bit, this came up in our discussions. I met with City Administrator Scott this afternoon, and we were looking at health benefit, or, insurance benefits for city workers, and I did notice a variation in the percentage of health benefits to salary depending on the department. Is that, why is that? Do you, so like like the sewer and the public works departments would have, their insurance benefits would be a higher ratio, higher percentage as to their salaries. Is there?
We haven't experienced that, certainly. I don't have visibility into the Regions plan because that's governed by AWC. I don't know if Councilmember Greenlee can comment on that, but certainly the Kaiser plan that we have, the same rate increase applies to all the city employees that are participating under that plan. So there's no difference in terms of what department you work for, and therefore the increase that would be associated with that.
Okay, so the component benefit, okay, well, I guess we'll have to find the answer to that, because that's not what I thought it was.
We do have, Councilmember, is it more a question of why do some union groups pay differently towards their benefits than
Why
other ones?
why some departments have a higher percentage of their benefits or a higher percentage of their salary?
Are you talking from a contractual basis, the city?
No, just from a budgetary basis. You look at the budgetary line item.
Oh, okay, all right, sorry. So that is based on contract, and all three of the four of our groups have a staggered rate in terms of their cost sharing for that insurance versus fire. They're on a 90-10 percentage. They pay 10% for spouses and dependents for their coverage, nothing for employee only, but yeah, so that's what, but the other
So it
three
varies,
groups pay
okay.
a straight dollar amount. Yeah.
Okay, and I indulge me one more question, because I'll have to ask this in the budget.
It has varied, and one of the things we're trying to do through negotiations, we've been in it since 2010, is to get as much standardization throughout the individual contracts as we can, so that everybody is, you're not paying 90-10 in fire, but police is doing something different, public works is doing something. We're trying to get to the best one, get everybody there, and then begin to whittle away at that one.
Okay. Then another question. Under the Affordable Care Act, there are some tax consequences for certain kinds of health plans that provide more coverage, I guess, than the federal government deems appropriate. Are we facing that at all?
You're getting into an area that
Okay.
I'm going to introduce a person, and maybe you can ask that question, because I think it's important that your questions do get answered. Corey Balkin, who is our broker, he's from Inner West Benefits, he's in the audience. I don't know, Corey, could you answer that for Councilmember Berger?
I think you're referencing the Cadillac tax.
I didn't want to use that word.
Sorry. And most of our municipal plans are on track to hit that Cadillac tax. And so it's these days that they're using to try and remedy what that means in terms of budget, because the tax is quite extensive. Just think of it in terms of the annual cost of your benefit indexed over the next several years, and assuming that the increases continue at the rate of your current premiums, that threshold is a reality under the current law.
How soon do you think we hit it?
Oh, it's 2018, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, there's years ahead of us. They'll fly by, but that's where you're seeing a lot of groups doing more aggressive plan design changes.
Okay.
And Corey, so everybody understands what that is basically employees who have richer benefit packages in regards to healthcare and that type of stuff potentially are going to be paying a tax on that additional benefit they get over and above what is perceived to be a standard level of health insurance.
Yes, and I know AWC has done a really good job in their presentation of illustrating what that is, and so we're all facing it. It's not specific to one group over another, but because we do spend so much time in the public sector, that's obviously on everybody's radar screen.
Thank you.
Thank you for indulging me, Mayor, on those
Absolutely.
non sequitur questions.
Paul?
If I could add one other thing, it turns out that correct me if I'm wrong, but I think City Hall tends to have more Kaiser people than Public Works does, for example, as a percentage. And this year, Kaiser went up considerably more than AWC employee benefits did. The previous year, that was reversed. So given the numbers are so small, when you look at a single year, that may get skewed because of you have different and relatively different insurers.
Okay.
Other questions for Jeanette in regards to the interlocal agreements? Connie Jo?
The fee of 200 and something, is that annually?
$260 per year.
That's reasonable, sure.
Any other questions? Okay, that takes care of that one. And then Jeanette, a resolution updating our personnel policies.
Yeah, the second item we were bringing forward next Tuesday for your consideration is a couple of updates to our personnel policies. The first update is the 1% salary adjustment in the budget proposal for non-represented employees. The second item has to do with our overtime policy. When we hired Rose as the executive assistant, as a non-represented, non-exempt employee, if you will, she was the only one that was a non-exempt employee that fell under the department head manual. And so it was an oversight on our part in terms of updating the personnel policies to reflect an increase in the cap from 40 comp hours to 60 comp hours, which is consistent with two of our collective bargaining agreements, police and AFSCME, if you will, for working 2,080 hours a week. So we're trying to bring consistency for an individual to also go up to that cap of 60 hours for comp time accrual, consistent with a couple of our bargaining units. So that's why that proposal is before you. So again, the recommended action will be to read the resolution by title only and pass post resolution in the usual manner. Any questions?
Jennifer?
It looks like under the current language, the comp time has to be used within 12 months of accrual.
Correct.
And under the proposed language, there is no time limit, is that correct?
Yes, I have struck that language too.
Okay, and what was the reasoning for that as
The
well?
reason for that is it's difficult to tell when that time has been accrued. And so I struck the language, and again, for consistency with the police contract and the AFSCME group, which don't have those provisions, I suggested similar language in our personnel policy.
That's all my questions, thank you.
Any other questions, David?
At a time when we're proposing to take more than $500,000 out of reserves, I don't think it's time to be talking about raises. Secondly, I must have missed this somewhere in the review of the contracts before, but I don't think that paying people for an hour and a half and having them work for an hour is a good deal for the taxpayers. How did we get to this?
Okay, I can comment, that's part of the Fair Labor Standards Act, that if an employee works more than 40 hours in a work week,
I'm familiar with Fair Labor, FLSA.
so therefore we're required to pay time and a half for those hours that are worked over 40 hours in a work week.
I wasn't familiar with the time and a half provision. We're talking about comp time, are we not?
Yeah.
Comp time is the same thing.
Comp time is the same. You can either accrue the hours as part of an accrual, if you will. So instead of taking the overtime in a paycheck, you take that time as part of a bank and take it as time off versus the dollars on a paycheck.
In the end, it ends up being the same number.
Right?
Yeah, I'm amazed at this. When did this particular provision come into FLSA?
Back in the 1930s.
1930s? I sure don't remember dealing with that, and I've been dealing with FLSA for a long time.
It's only when it comes, the overtime is for our non-exempt employees that be eligible for overtime.
Maybe that's it. I never had any non-exempt employees. I had managers and workers, that was it. Okay, well,
I'm
there,
happy to send you some information, Councilmember.
it's a special crew. I understand. Thank you.
Connie Jo?
Well, just to tag on to Jennifer's question about, there's no deadline to take the time. Is there a cap on the amount of hours?
Yes, 60, that's what I'm proposing. to move it from 40 to
Oh, that's
60.
the big red 60. Thank you.
Any other items from council? Jeanette, thank you. Moving on to Public Works. Jim, you got a hearing for us on CDBG grant funds.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. As you may recall, last week, council authorized Agenda Bill 6812 to set the public hearing for CDBG. And tonight, we are requesting to hold the public hearing next week, December 3rd. And in your packet, you should have a draft resolution for your consideration. And if it is the council's desire, the resolution would be approved after the public hearing on December 3rd. With that, are there any questions regarding the public hearing for CDBG?
I think we're good. Thank you, Jim. And-
Actually, I've got a quick question. Does it help our case if there actually are comments?
I don't believe so. We're required to hold the public hearings. And I don't think it helps our case if there's comments. Maybe if there were positive comments, it might.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, going,
I do have a really quick question, and it might be a little confusing because it's referring to what I saw last week in the proposed resolution. The budgeted amount, I believe, was, what was it, 130% or something like that?
Yeah, it's 138.
$138?
$138,000 is our requested amount.
are we talking dollars or are we talking percentages?
No, I would have to pull the packet from last week because it's not on here.
It's below 50% of the total project costs.
I didn't mention it last week because I thought it might have been a typo. But
It
I see
might
where
be.
you've got actual figures in here.
Was
this
it
year-
the
this time.
146%?
Yes.
Yes, that's a typo.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, never
It-
mind.
It's 46%.
Okay, thank you. That makes more sense. All right.
Any other items from council? Okay. Jennifer, budget.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I wanted to give a quick update on, we haven't made any changes to the overall revenues and expenditures, so the draft ordinance that was in the packet is the most current and up-to-date. I am going to be adding to the Dropbox a new page 10, I think it is. Let me check really fast. I reprinted it and it says 1 of 1. So yes, page 10 is going to change slightly in the unreserved ending fund balance. I have been refining the beginning fund balance numbers, matching them back to audited financials and kind of truing those up. And the correct number with the mayor's proposed budget for the unreserved ending fund balance should be 1,092,093. So it went down just slightly due to refining of the beginning fund balances, but it's still 10% of, or it's still 10% of unrestricted, unencumbered reserves. So it's just down a percentage point. Other than that refining, I've been trying to go through and clean everything up, fix any typos or any confusing points. But other than that, the numbers haven't changed. We wanted to provide an opportunity again to discuss the budget and ask questions.
Council. Brent, did you get most of your questions answered today?
Yeah, just barely. Seconds to spare.
Good time management. Any other questions from council?
On the budget?
Yes.
Book. Thank you for the opportunity. First of all, I wanted to thank the mayor and the staff for putting this budget together. I don't know if anybody realizes what an effort it is to put a budget together, but one this size is a tremendous undertaking, and a lot of people participated in this. And every one of them worked hard, I can guarantee you that. That having been said, I've got some problems with some of the things that are in the budget. And I brought these concerns to Mr. Scott with a 45-minute phone conversation. I always enjoy my conversations with him. I don't always influence him, but I always enjoy the conversation. Learn a few things in the process. One of the things I learned in a subsequent conversation was that I had absolutely no impact on what the administration is going to bring forward. So I thought I'd talk briefly about some of the issues that I've got, and then I will show up next week prepared to make amendments for my council colleagues to do something with. I hope they'll support me on these things. First of all, I don't think people are aware that there was an email exchange between the administration and me while I was gone. I had to take a trip to Kauai last week. It was a dirty job, but somebody had to do it. City has denied me hardship pay for that particular time, but somebody had to go. At any rate, while I was gone, I asked that some things be delayed until I could get back and we'd have a chance to discuss them. And out of that email exchange with the council members, which was one way for me to them because they can't answer me out of session, and with the administration, which was two ways, came some clarification. And it's this type of clarification that changes minds. The info, for example, on the need to pass the Sahuita Action Agreement to satisfy another agreement with Camas and the port may have been in there somewhere, but it didn't come out until this meeting. I watched the tapes of the meeting. Brent, thank you for bringing that out the way you did. Mr. Mayor, thank you for clarifying that. Dave, good show. I liked all of your comments. Had I had that info last week, it could have saved me taking my vacation time to send all these emails. That being said, I still have concerns about the value of both agreements to the taxpayers of Washougal. I understand Councilmember Greenlee's concerns that he raised last week in my absence about the availability and usability of performance data on this contract. Nevertheless, I would like to see sometime next year, one, the performance data that are available. And I would like to use these, as Mr. Greenlee suggested, as a benchmark, as opposed to an evaluation, which was my initial position. I learned something, Paul. Thank you. The second thing is there's a list of deliverables in that contract. And we're not dependent upon data for that, and I'd like to see those. Among them are the strategic plan, benchmarking data, and a variety of other things. I'm not aware that those have been provided by Sahuita, and I think it would be a good idea to have these things. I am in favor of this particular economic development agreement for the time being, although I'm not generally in favor of economic development efforts based on their performance across the country. And I'm in favor of Paul Dennis heading up the effort. I think he's got the background to do it. What I do want to do is to make doggone sure that the taxpayers get their money's worth, and the only way to do that is to have the data to evaluate what's going on, and that's what I see missing, and that was the centerpiece of our email exchange. Thank you for taking the time to do that.
You bet. I think we're all on the same page there, Dave.
I think we are. It took us a while to get there, but that's, all this talk has a benefit. On the budget, the major items that I have a problem with are the items which will come out of the reserves. And it shouldn't be any secret to anybody at this point that the reason for that is because they're coming out of the reserves. I'm involved in incident command system training with FEMA. And one of the things that came out of that, I was down there 2 weeks ago in Bend to take one of their courses. And one of the lessons for me that came out of that was, don't depend on FEMA. I was not impressed with FEMA. I was not impressed with their planning. I was not impressed with their organization, and I'm sure as heck not impressed with their funding and follow-up. And if you think Katrina was bad down in New Orleans, Sandy was even worse up in the New Jersey area. I've got friends up there who are similarly unimpressed with FEMA. So I don't want to rely on them. I want to have the reserves that we can do things here. And an ending balance in the reserves, as I understand it, about 1.3 million after we take this money out of reserves this year. Is that right, about 1.3?
That was the number I just refined to the 1,092,093.
Okay, I
So it's
yeah,
just
I
slightly
picked up on
smaller.
that figure today. Forgot about that, thank you. So it's less than I anticipated. That's just over $1 million, about $1.1 million. I think you can pretty well eat that up in overtime for the police and the fire department in any of 4 contingencies that could happen to this city: fire, flood, earthquake, and
Ice storm?
ice storm or other kinds of storm which knock out roadways, drop bridges, and do all the kinds of things that wreak havoc on a community. Thank you. I remember the 4th one. I had a Rick Perry moment there. And as a result of that, I want to make sure that we have the reserves to deal with that. And 1.1 million doesn't strike me as a good starting balance in such an emergency. I'm not in favor of the property management fund. If there is a deal to be made and it's a good deal, I would love to see that brought forward at the time. I'm not in favor of setting aside funding for a contingency because it takes it out of the reserves and puts it into the spendable column, and I don't want to see that. Also, in that particular item, there are 3 items that it's for. Parking is one of them in the downtown, parks, and open spaces. Parks and open spaces are funded, in my knowledge, primarily from park impact fees and other associated funding that goes with parks and recreation. The parking issue, Mitch and I had quite a battle on that when I was on the Planning Commission. At that point, there was a proposal to reduce the number of parking spaces downtown, and I fought to get away from that, and I lost. I think we reduced the reduction somewhat, but I certainly didn't consider it a victory. And I find it interesting now that the proposal coming forward is to not only increase the number of parking spaces, but to fund them as well. And I consider that to be a function of developers and property owners. So I'm concerned about using public monies for purposes which generally I consider to be those of the private financing world. And I would like to drop those 2 things out of the budget. We have $76,000 in there, I think, for what's the 76K for again?
For fee holidays.
The fee holidays. And I was initially in favor of that. I'm going to be interested to see what the rest of the council has to say on that. I don't like the idea of taking it out of the reserves, but I like the idea of the fee holiday. But I want to hear my councils on that particular, my fellow council members on that particular point. There's another expenditure coming out of reserves, and that's $21,000 for capital expenditure for the computer systems, which we need. And I'm trying to find out why we don't have $21,000 in the budget somewhere that would cover that, so that we don't have to take it out of reserves. Since I've been on the council, there's been a steady, in fact, before I was on the council, there's been a steady drumbeat of, we need to get this done, and let's take it out of the reserves. The one follows the other like night follows day. I'm not in favor of that. From my standpoint, reserves are for emergencies. Mr. Mayor, in your letter, you indicate that you've managed the monies very carefully, and I have to compliment you on that. I agree wholeheartedly. I'm very proud of the way this administration manages money. I just think it could do a little better in some areas, and that 20K is one of them, 21K is one of them. But credit where credit is due. The administration has done a great job on this, and the staff has been a good part of that. But they took their direction from the mayor, who said, I want you to manage better. So I give him the credit. The idea of helping our low-income neighbors with paying their city utility bills. I've been on that particular portion of the economic scale, and I had trouble paying my economic bills, my utility bills. On the other hand, I got them paid, and that required some sacrifices, including selling my car, emptying out my savings account, selling my savings bonds, and a variety of other things, even borrowing money. But I got it done. I don't think it's the place of government to be in the business of helping people pay their bills. If it is the project of government, I think it's far above this level. I think it belongs at the county, state, and federal level. And at the county level, it's funded, I think, primarily by the state. I don't think we belong in the charity business, which is another reason that I will be challenging the $7,500 for the organization across the street. We provide them with the building and the maintenance and the utilities in the building. I think that's a major contribution, and I don't want to see the extra $7,500 go to that. There's a $5,000 allocation in the budget for the community education, and I think that's a function of the school district. And granted, their contribution to that is over $20,000, but I don't see that as a function of the city. When times were flush, and we had all kinds of fee income rolling in here from the development that was going on in town, it was one thing to consider. Now that times are tight, I think it's time to take that one off the books. The other thing that bothers me is that there's a problem with financing our street maintenance budget. And of all the things, when you get the basics taken care of, the water, the sewer, I mean, you gotta have toilets that flush, and you gotta have drinking water, and certain basic services, fire, police, all that sort of thing. Once you get those taken care of, the next thing that comes up to me is roads and streets, because everything depends upon the ability to go somewhere. The fire people depend on it, the police depend on it, commerce depends on it, citizens depend on it. Citizens depend on it because this is not a bicycle-friendly town. And even with all these bicycle lanes that we're getting, you still have to go some distance to get your groceries and everything else, and then you have to get it home. I don't see many people riding the bus carrying big bags of groceries. Have you ever tried that? That's a lot of fun, especially on a wet day, because the bag drops out of the bottom drops out of the bag and your stuff goes all over. And a lot of people will help you pick it up, and some of them will actually give it all back to you, and some of them won't. Streets are absolutely essential, and we ought to be making sure that they're maintained on a priority basis. I don't believe in taking that money out of the reserves. I think we should take that money out of the budget. If that means something else has to go, then something else has to go. We need a priority list. I haven't seen one yet. Every year, we look at the budget and say, well, okay, yeah, this year, this will be a priority, and next year, that'll be a priority. But where's the list of priorities? What comes first in this city? Years ago, when Gary Locke was governor of this state, he set up a budgeting system that was run by a fellow out of Minnesota. Can't remember his name at the moment, but I had the pleasure of talking with him when I worked at the Little Hoover Commission in California. And basically, it worked like this. He came in as a consultant and he said to Gary Locke and his staff, you tell me what the 10 top priorities are for funding in the state of Washington. And he went away. And he came back several months later and he got their answer. And it took him that long to come up with it. And they said, okay, here are our top 10 priorities. He said, great. How much money do you have? What's your income for the year? They put that on the table. He said, okay, start allocating it. Priority 1, they get funded in their entirety. Priority 2, they get funded in their entirety. Paul, help me out here. How far down the priority list did they get? 6?
I really don't remember. I remember the process, but I don't remember how far down they got the list.
The key thing is that they didn't get all the way down the list. And this guy said at that point, well, you're out of money. These people don't get funded this year. Contract them out, make them form partnerships with the people that did get the money, tell them to go out and beg on the street with a tin cup, whatever. But they don't get funded this year because they weren't in your priority list. So Gary Locke and his team went back and they re-massaged this thing, and they didn't fund everybody that year. And I believe that's when, wasn't that when the Department of Licensing was contracted out?
Department of Licensing isn't contracted out.
Say again?
State of Washington still runs Department of Licensing.
I thought that was a contract operation. Okay.
They
Well,
they contract out satellite offices, though.
I see.
Always have.
So that was a start. But there were other things that were contracted out so that they could keep their priorities. And that's what I'm looking for, and that's why I'm always looking for a mission statement here. I want a mission statement that says, we do this, this, and this. I don't want a vision of the future. I'm not looking for all this touchy-feely stuff. What I'm looking for is, we do this, this, and this. Because when the budget comes in here, I want to be able to say, okay, we do this, this, and this. Those are our priorities. When the money runs out, it's gone. Cut it off right there. I don't want to hear, let's take it out of reserves, because we've gone from maybe $6 million in reserves back in 2010, early 2011. We had 4.2 plus 2.1.
I don't remember a time when the city ever had $6 million in reserves in any
No.
way, shape, or form.
2010 was 4.7.
Okay, and then down below, in that chart you sent us today, it had another 2.1 in other reserves. What was that?
So there's a total and then it's broken out in between. So that's just the breakout of the total. It's not an
Okay.
additional.
So let's just focus on that 4.7, was it?
In 10, if you're looking at 10, yes.
Yes. 4.7? $4.7 million. And we're proposing to take that down to $1,100,000.
No, that's in total. So the total for the 13 budget would be roughly 2.9 million in total. So you're comparing, if you're going to compare the totals, it would be 4.7 and 10 to 2.9 and 13.
Okay, so we're taking more than half.
That includes what we've already done with the 750 to the transportation fund and the 500 to the building fund
Sure.
and the 600 to the ER&R fund.
So we've drawn that down more than half in 3 years. And my first question is, when does that end? And I want to see that end. And I speak not as Dave Shoemaker and not as a council member. I speak as a representative of the people, the taxpayers of this community. And with that, I will quit boring you, and next week I will bring in my list of proposals for changing the budget. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Kind Joe?
Can I ask a question about procedure? What I'm observing is that each individual discusses their bullet points. Do we ever have an opportunity, he brings up a topic and we all get to discuss it
You're in
tonight?
that right now?
Okay, because I would have liked to have jumped in on and had a conversation on each topic. And when you didn't, he was just running off at the, no, I mean, he was just,
I made good notes.
you made good notes, okay, good. Because I'm sure that we'd all have some input on each one of those topics, basically. But I mean, I think we could just take your letter right here if, I don't know, I'm not gonna tell you how to do it, but go down the expenditures in your letter.
I think for the last month or since we've rolled this out, we've been waiting
just
and
been
welcoming
open.
any discussion from any council
Okay.
members about my letter, about
Let's
the budget,
discuss the
about any
letter.
of that. We're waiting.
Well, that's really what he just did. He just went, itemized those letters. So can we talk about, the first page of your letter, which is basically page 3 of the packet? The use of the impact fees for the parks. So that seemed to me like a conflict, because we were saying, let's take 500,000 and buy land for parks, open space, and parking. And in the same letter, it says, we're gonna use park impact fees to develop, to improve these parks. Can you help me, Jennifer, know how much comes in for those park impact fees? What page those are on?
Park impact fees are on page 54.
54. So we bring in 70,000 on impact fees?
It is dependent upon development in the residential side, but yes, that's a conservative estimate.
And so,
And they must be spent within,
6 years.
they, legislature changed it to 10. Impact fees got extended to a 10-year period. It used to be a 6-year timeframe.
so we already have roughly, approximately $70,000 that is free to be spent. Is that correct?
No, you have 600, almost $700,000.
So you got to add in the beginning fund balance. So under 2013 requested, we have total revenue and fund balance of 642.
642.
Estimated for 13. Not counting any grant revenue that Suzanne has been so wonderful at obtaining.
So I tend to agree that I would like to see anything we spend on parks come out of the park impact fees.
Excuse me.
Yes,
Point of clarification on that. Don't we have to match that, the PIF fees with some other, so it's not, doesn't work like TIF fees?
Sometimes it depends on grants.
Depends
We
on
have
the
to
grant.
use matching funds for grants, but no.
Well, with TIF fees, you have to use, you can't just use traffic impact fees.
Sure.
You have to have some match with that, don't you?
We could, if we could afford the complete transportation project just off of the TIF, but that's not tenable. So TIF becomes private match, low percentage for the very expensive transportation projects that we do. And to score highly for those transportation dollars, you want to maximize your private match. And right now, TIF is really the only flavor of money that meets the private match requirement in that context. But we could, if we had adequate funds in a TIF account, build an entire project just from TIF funds. They're at our disposal for those projects. And
It'd take 1,000 years, though, to build up that.
it wouldn't.
In today's market, yes.
Yes, transportation projects, as you know, are millions of dollars. The part, on the other hand, as you can see in the proposed programmed expenditures in this particular fund, you can make investments in ground and hold, or you can make improvements to ground, and we're proposing both in this budget. And you can often accomplish that within the scope of your PIF funding. Our parks capital facility plan is not funded completely. PIF is a part of that. PIF is not the only source of money that can be used for parks. It is definitely only able to be used for parks, but it's not the only source. You can always use your general funds. You can use REIT money as well for capital acquisition. You have a lot of choices and options, council, for how you would make park acquisitions or park improvements. But PIF certainly has to only be used for that, but it's not the only source that you
And
have.
cannot be used for operations and maintenance, can only be used for the acquisition and the development.
Right.
That's for capital items.
So we have funding here already that could be used.
Let me, and I'm sorry I can't be clearer on this, there are two things that we're trying to do in the budget and asking for the $500,000 allocation from unallocated reserves. One is, and it'll take a little bit of trust on your side, the $640,000 that Jennifer currently has in park impact fees. I am hopeful by the end of 2013 that the council will be completely depleting that entire fund. And that's going to be for the acquisition of potentially two pieces of property that, when it's all said and done, the discussions that are underway are all said and done, I'm fairly certain it'll be a 7-0 vote by this council to acquire the properties. But it will completely deplete that entire park impact fee fund to do it, plus participation by the state, participation by private entities, and participation by the county.
That's what it's for, so
That's what it's for.
like you're saying, why
But it's
wouldn't it
gonna
be a
disappear there.
7-0 vote? Sure.
So,
So the
knowing that, which is something that you all don't have the information on, and I realize that, that's one of the reasons for plugging those use of reserves in there. The other reason is very philosophical, and it is in answer to developers and property owners and business owners in the downtown core of, city, what are you going to do for us next to help with the momentum that we have going downtown? You did a portion of Main Street, which is wonderful, but it's only a portion, and it only went so far. It was a lot of money, but it only went so far. What other things are you prepared to do as a city to help that
Have they come
momentum keep
before
going?
us and said those words, or have they come before you? You guys have met?
I've had numerous discussions. I think Adam, in your last meeting, said basically the same thing.
Right, that was my
Those things are important to them when they're
first time to
putting
meet
lots of
Adam.
money in. And certainly the gentleman that Adam works for is putting in abnormally large share of the development money into the properties now.
So it's hard to understand on this side.
Now, I do want to make sure that you all completely understand on the ask for the $500,000. It is an ask to transfer funds from the reserve accounts, the unallocated reserves, to a acquisition account. But it is money that can be pulled back to reserves if you choose to pull it back to reserves for some other use. And it is also not a spending account, because the provision has been put on there that even though those funds are moved over, any purchases out of those will have to come back to this council. So, Dave, when you talk about a spending account, to me or to the general public, that sounds like once you put it over there, I can go do with it whatever I want. Not the case. I think it's clearly spelled out that council will have to have the approval of any of those properties, whether it's $1 or whether it's $500,000 for a piece of property. So, I want to make sure everybody understands that.
What's
This is
the
just moving
philosophy
funds.
behind leaving it in reserves and pulling it out at the time you see a property that's for sale, it's a really good deal, versus moving all that into acquisition fund?
I think it's a whole different message to those in the public and those private property owners and the developers when we proactively say we are going to begin planning for additional steps in the downtown specifically, versus saying if A and B and C happens, then X, Y, and Z, if it all comes about. To me, if I was a property owner, I'd say, yeah, your government. That doesn't mean anything to me. You've left yourself too much hiding space. In the end, it's all the same dollars. I interrupted one of
No,
your trains
no.
of thought, though, on that.
This is just talk about the 500,000 and the parks, I mean, they all blend together.
Yep.
You know, the park impact fees, the 500,000.
Since a lot of this is, sorry, haven't been recognized.
Brent?
Okay. A lot of this discussion surrounds reserve funds, and Jennifer, you quoted a $1,093,000 reserve fund, but then I see in the mayor's letter.
Yes, I refined the numbers
Yeah,
today.
you refined, there was a it was 1.3 million in the
Right.
mayor's letter, but then there's a total reserve fund of 3.1 million, which is 27%, almost 28% of our operating expenses.
26 now.
And then there's 16% of the operating budget. Can you explain the distinction between those?
The 16% is the council policy required necessary reserves.
And I remember attending the AWC conference in Leavenworth, and they said 2 months of operations, which is 16%.
Correct.
We're just following what AWC recommends on a prudent reserve level.
That was the policy that the council set, yes.
Okay. And
Which
it's
equates
based
to-
upon standard practice of cities.
It fluctuates throughout the state, but
Yeah.
that's kind of the baseline that most cities follow, I think. We did a little bit of research, and it's pretty much, like, we found some as low as 8% and some as high as 26%. So it's really across the board.
And what's this 27% number?
That was the total, the 16% and the 11% that we originally had estimated in there. But now that I've refined the beginning balance, it's down to 26% in total.
Okay. So we're still running about 10% above
Correct.
the AWC recommended operating reserve.
Correct.
Operating reserve. Okay.
And that's, I believe, Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, that's if you do not count in reserves, things like the building contingency,
Correct.
the ER&R fund, and the infrastructure matching funds.
Correct. I didn't add
Which-
any of those funds that have been transferred to other funds. That's solely what is truly unencumbered, is 10%.
And the funds that are in those three funds are funds that, when we asked to have you transfer them, I believe we had a very clear discussion that if at any time those needed to be pulled back to reserves, that those were available as
Well, and
reserves.
that's kind of leads me to our next question, this $500,000 that we're setting up. If before we find a great deal for parking in downtown Washougal, we have an emergency, we have another Columbus Day storm, which I remember one of the first memories is that my child was that storm. If we had something like that happen and we needed to pull it back, could we somehow identify this fund as something until we spend it on some property acquisition, that it's also something that would be available for a reserve kind of situation without having to come back and do a supplemental budget? You understand my question?
Yes, if there are no appropriations made in the fund to expend from it, you would have to do a supplemental budget.
But if you identified the fund, defined the fund differently, its purpose is differently to include this twin possibility of being a reserve fund. Which
You do.
And also a property acquisition fund. It's just basically some kind of contingency fund of some sort.
In any emergency, even if all of these funds were just in the general reserves, you've appropriated $10 of expenditures for the year, and we have an emergency and we need to spend 12, you will have to come back and appropriate the additional $2. So no matter what you do, you have to do a supplemental budget. We can't spend more than you've appropriated. Sometimes those are called cleanup or true-up budgets, and you can kind of ride over the line in an emergency. We could get you together very quickly to make those emergency appropriations. I think, Councilman, the value in what you're suggesting is that in the budget document, in the narrative that describes the purpose, it could clarify the point that the mayor has made about the potential fluidity of the fund for different purposes, and you could state that. We didn't do that, for example, with the equipment repair and replacement fund. We didn't do that with the other two funds to specifically say it is noted that these are still general fund dollars and that the council has discretion with these funds for other purposes. It's inherent within those funds that that is true. It could be stated so that it's readily observable.
I'm just saying is just making a, you can have a, I don't know, you can have a fund that has a dual purpose of being a reserve fund, but also a property acquisition fund if the right circumstances come up for it. You can say, this fund, this $500,000 can be used for either one of these if something happens. And the other thing that causes, I think, a little difficulty with the council is we're kind of looking at this $500,000 as we're not exactly sure how it's going to be spent. You know, if a good deal comes along, well, we might approve it. The deal may or may not look that good in the final analysis, but we don't really know how it's going to check out. And I think that causes some heartburn here. But
I believe we did send out a communication, a confidential communication to council members.
Right.
That, a couple of them that identified specific pieces of property in order to make it a little bit clearer on a map,
Right.
which pieces
That's
we were specifically targeting.
That's correct. That's correct.
Does that map designate this piece we're considering parking, this piece? I couldn't remember. It does?
It's one of the emails.
I believe somewhere in the 2 or 3 emails that went out, I believe
I gotta
that's
go
true.
back
If
over
not,
that.
I'll double check, and if not, we can certainly, almost positive it does. It's probably in my original one. And Don, before you ask the question, no, you cannot get copies of those emails, but thank you for asking.
Unless she goes to court.
For the rest of the public, and same thing for Martha, it does involve potential real estate acquisition. That's why the reason that we put the confidentiality under our ability to not necessarily talk openly about something.
I know a good Public Records Act lawyer if you want to. But the other problem I have with the $500,000, it also kind of transmits a message about what our city's bottom line is on these acquisitions, and might kind of tie our negotiating position a little bit, is one of the thoughts I had on it, on these properties. So,
I could certainly ask for more.
they can certainly ask for more.
No, I said I could.
Oh.
Sure could. So
That'd
can
be
I
a
still
waste of
ask
time,
more
though.
clarification on it?
Yeah.
You okay? So, again, it's a philosophy, so to say, I think you use that phrase. And we want to show the business people that are looking into our city that we're interested in you, we want you to be interested in us. What's your opinion on using that for park and open space? I'm good with helping, I'm good with considering helping business people, business investors to help with parking. But I'm not necessarily good with parks and open space. So what's your philosophy on all 3 of those subjects, saying we want $500,000 to do any of these 3? What about parking only and leaving out the other 2? What does that say to the businessman?
I don't know that it necessarily, I've not thought about the question in that fashion. You ask a simple question that, like any others, get to be fairly complex. I think it is an odd standard when we set up as a city and say, because we recognize the downtown area as it's defined as a special area, we're going to give you building incentives that to some degree say, we're not going to cause you to have as much parking, dedicated parking, that you have to provide, Mr. Businessman, as we would to somebody on E Street or somebody out on Highway 14. But then we also, as a city, don't turn around and make some properties available for that parking. At some point, we're going to have a parking problem. And that's a good thing,
But
and it's
if
a
we're
bad
for
thing.
parking,
Pardon?
I'm saying if let's say the council's in favor of providing for parking, we wouldn't necessarily need as much if we went forward to buy land just for parking and set aside those ideas of open space.
If we wanted to do.
Why would a businessman care if we have some open space down the road?
Because I believe our end result and what we want to do with that space, and I'm not even sure where the term open space got into this conversation, because I haven't termed any of it open space. I think I've only termed it park space. Might have used
Put
open
these
space in
readers
there,
on.
but if I did, that was an error,
Okay.
because any of the pieces that I've envisioned would be parks. And that's where I say it would be short-sighted, I think, on our, okay, thank you. I think it would be decided on our part not to have in what will eventually be the full build-out of our downtown, not to have some city-owned properties that are usable as park space in what will be pretty much the center of that area. I would imagine somewhere down the road, 20 years, 30 years, people sitting there going, gosh, we build up downtown from River Road to 32nd. I wish we had planned something in the middle of there that we could have used for. City of Camas is going through the same thing, have been for years. They've been trying to figure out where to site a plaza downtown, but everything's built. They have no space left. They're thinking about vacating a street in order to provide a plaza. Something, and we even have the brick plaza that we have here, but we don't have green. We don't have that integral part that's part of that.
Yeah. Well, I've worked in downtowns, and I think mostly of people that use the spaces in a downtown would be the employee, not the city, but the employees that work in the
daytime
downtown. They want to
employees.
go outside, sit at a table, and eat lunch, play with their kids in the park.
Yep.
So, I see where you're coming from, and you didn't, should we scratch out open space?
Sure. Now, one of the options that we have out there, probably at any point as well, and Mitch and Jim can jump in on it as well, we have properties that the city owns in the downtown now. We have all the property around this building. We've got property up against the railroad tracks. We can always put in our own permits to ourselves and turn those into parking lots as well. We have space available. It's trying to figure out at some point, and that's one of the things that we're trying to get through the strategic planning and through some of the processes that'll come out of that, of how best to use the properties that we do have for the betterment of the community itself.
Is that the
Not
planning,
necessarily
is that
a
a
new-
planning committee? Is that a council, or is that a combination?
I think it's a complete dusted off, fresh relook at what we now know to be happening in our downtown versus, Mitch, when was that plan put together?
The core plan was adopted in
5?
5.
So 7 years, 8 years later, our entire economy is completely different than what that was looking at when that was even put together.
Yeah.
What was looking at them as coming up in the reality of the short term might not even be our long term at
And
this
that's
point.
exactly why we're thinking, shouldn't we be holding on to things, because it still hasn't turned around. Now,
Not, and keep in mind, I'm pretty cheap with money.
Can you verify that?
So for me to turn around and say,
Looking at the
I want to
wife.
go potentially spend this money, isn't something I'd normally go do. It would be more normal for me to go, because of steps 1, 2, and 3, I think it would be good to spend an amount of money on a specific thing at some point that probably doesn't completely fulfill itself until step 4 or 5. But we got it at a funding level back at funding 1. We have properties that are available for sale now. Not something we'd be condemning, not something that we'd be beg, borrowing, or stealing. We've got an open market.
Speculation.
To
It's a
me,
hard one.
to me, it doesn't do a lot of good on a city standpoint to have, when you add them together, a significant into the millions of dollars of unallocated, non-programmed funds. And I'm fiscally conservative. That doesn't do me any good. Either figure out a way to use those funds or return them to the taxpayers, one of the two. Not all of them. I believe we need a cushion in there, but I think we've found through the years, and I think one of the reasons that certain communities held on to funds and built larger reserve funds, I think to some degree we have whittled away those reasons over the years, and that's a positive. I believe we've whittled them away in things like the city's negotiating with the sheriff's department for an insurance package that includes a SWAT team whenever we need it throughout a year, rather than just the overtime bills. I think we've whittled it away in interlocal agreements between police departments, fire departments as far away as Portland, in case we all need resources rather than one entity having to pick all of that up. Even in the case of a major disaster like we had in December of last year. We had some overtime bills, but we in no way, shape, or form paid what the total bill was to all the agencies that we received assistance from. And that today, if they have a problem, we send officers and firefighters to assist them as well, and don't send them a bill, because all of that has been put in place in the last few years.
It's like insurance policy.
To some degree, it's more everybody getting along and not necessarily, recognizing that you're gonna get paid for everything. Chief, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the years of if we have a homicide in the city that could cost us $1 million in investigation and overtime and all of that and bankrupt a city, I'm not so sure that that exists anymore. Through our interlocals with the Major Crimes Unit and all of those things, we've got resources that we are able to pull on willingly that are not major dollars we have to have in the bank today to write those checks, because we've got all these expenses coming in. So it's a little bit of, that's the way we used to do business, because that's the way you had to do business and you had to budget. I don't believe in today's world, if we have a major catastrophe, yeah, we're gonna have some bills to pay. That's why, quite frankly, that's why in our contingency plans, Jennifer's position, the finance director, is mobilized at some point to literally take a checkbook and go out and sit in instant command and decide what she's paying for, how she's paying for it, and where it's going, and keep it all straight. Because that reality still exists, but not to the dollar amounts that we were talking years and years ago in terms of what is a healthy reserve over and above what we need just for cash flow.
How long ago what year was that 16% determined?
I have no idea.
Long time ago?
No, no,
Actually,
it could not have been a long time ago, because,
It's AWC.
No, it was Jeff, it was
was-
under Jeff's
Yeah.
administration.
so 8 years ago, 10 years ago?
But the 16% is not for that purpose, it's for cash flow.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying,
Well,
over and above the 16%.
You're touching on something that I'd been thinking that I wanted to bring up, and maybe we need to revisit, not necessarily the 16%, but do we want to put a number on the reserves, unrestricted reserves? So that we can say, we're not ever going to go below this unrestricted reserve either, so that we can feel comfortable, for those of us that have that philosophy of, we need to have a lot more set aside. It's just something the council should revisit. I think if we could ask administration to, after we get through this budget, to remind us to revisit.
Yeah, I don't think we have a problem doing that. It's just, it will be the first exercise of just understanding what might be in the thinking of, what do we need to plan for? Do we need to plan for our worst possible snow and ice event? Or do we need to plan for 2 of those, or?
It's pretty inevitable.
Something in order to put something in
Yeah,
there.
sure.
I'd like to make the comment that I don't believe governments are in the business of collecting taxes to save the money. It should be used, and it should be used for the community where it's collected, and if it isn't used, it shouldn't be collected. And a reserve should be, that's prudent business procedures. But building a fund for whatever is, I think, irresponsible.
And I disagree. In about the middle of Mayor Jeff Guard's administration was the first time that the city had a policy on reserves at all. There were no reserves. And then at that time, there was a finance director by the name of Becky Hassard. And between Jeff and then the subsequent mayor, Stacy Sellers, who kept Becky as the finance director for quite a number of years. The thing was, in '06 and in '07, the money was rolling in because we get sales tax on the building materials when somebody builds a house. I've forgotten now whether it was 2006 or 2007, we put out 454 single-family building permits. We won't reach 50 this year.
No, I bought one of those.
And the problem is, if you look at, even if you're not an economist, you certainly understand that there is a cycle, if you will, to the economy. And one of the functions of a reserve is to level that revenue. So in the good years, you put money into reserves, into savings. You don't spend it all, because then when the economy tanks and the money stops rolling in, now what do? You're laying off police, you're killing off your fire department, you're not doing any road maintenance at all because you don't have any money. The reason that we have these reserves is because when the money was rolling in, Becky especially used to pound on the table and say, "Thou shalt not spend thy one-time money on ongoing expenses."
We're going to call you Becky from now on.
And that's how we came into a reserve position that is better than any other city with the exception of La Center. La Center's an odd case because a whole lot of their revenue comes from the card rooms, and they're worried that the card rooms will go away if the Cowlitz get their casino. So they actually have a reserve of over 400%. But I can't think of another city in the state of Washington that that's true of. But if you go up, if you hang out at AWC, our 40-some% total reserve is the envy of most cities. It gives us opportunities to do things when
26.
the economy is poor
36.
and prices are low. We can buy things that we wouldn't be able to afford when prices are high. So the function of reserves, just like the 16%, what that's for is to level out the cash flow. We get property tax essentially twice a year. And that's a big piece of our revenue. So we need something to kind of level out the peaks and the valleys in our revenue. And that's the function of the 16%. Now, if you're a city the size of Vancouver or the city the size of Seattle, you probably don't need 16% because your cash flow doesn't fluctuate so much. This city gets very small amounts of sales tax revenue from any source other than building new houses. In fact, in some months, Safeway is our biggest sales tax provider, and almost nothing that they sell is taxable. So reserves have a very important role in leveling out peaks and valleys in revenue. That's point number one. Number two is that at the point that Mayor Gard took over, we had a very, very different way of doing budgeting. What we did was, for example, Public Works was budgeted for 2 major snowstorms every year. If we didn't get those storms, we didn't spend the money, and it was an ending fund balance that rolled into the next year. We never called it a reserve. It was an ending fund balance. But once you pull all of those ending fund balances together, and I would actually include in those equipment repair and replacement reserves and all of the other reserve funds which Mayor Gard set up. If you add all of those together and compare, which is the number that's directly comparable to the 4.7 when he took over, they're very, very close to the same number. We have not been overspending. It's a matter of we're presenting the budget in a different way. I would say that the budget that we're doing now is much more transparent. It's much easier to understand, still opaque. And part of that problem is, as was mentioned earlier, is BARS, which stands for
Budgeting and Reporting System?
And I claim that's a misnomer, that the B really stands for Byzantine. It is the most bizarre set of accounting rules I've come across. And it is very difficult to make a transparent budget under the BARS rules. I'm jumping around here, and so, I mean, that's kind of the major point that I wanted to make about how, in order to be comparing the 4.7, you really need to make a fair comparison, and that's not simple. Because we've taken money out of that 4.7, and now we call it an equipment repair and replacement reserve. It's still a reserve fund. But we don't list it as being part of reserves because it's allocated to equipment repair and replacement. On the other hand, could the council in a single night, even as an emergency special meeting, roll that money into police or fire or public works street repair? Yes, we could.
If it's still there.
Right. But we took that money out of reserves to create the initial funds. We are funding those reserves every year operationally. So the amount of money in that fund at the beginning of this next year will be roughly what it was at the beginning of last year.
I'm not sure that's true, Paul, because we spent a lot of that money.
We did, and we're rolling some cash into it, are we not?
Well,
Smaller amounts, yes.
plus, we initially seeded the accounts, I think is the term we like to use, seeded those accounts with money from reserves, with the indication that they could that, in my mind, when I add up reserves, I would add those up with them. Jennifer doesn't, and that's where she gets her 26%, because she's clearly keeping them separate. In my mind, you've got the ability to pull those back. We seeded the accounts with them. Some of it we've spent on equipment, on those things that we needed to get done. Some of it we're gonna spend this year on replacing the roof, the AC systems on this building, which if you walk through the back offices, we've got buckets out there on the days it's raining again. I thought those had gone away forever. But we are doing, for some of those accounts, we are doing operational transfers into them of some amount of money each year. I think the bigger portion, though, in one thing that is not always recognized by the council, only because we probably don't tout it enough, is the fact that in 2009, the council that was in place then approved a budget that spent $1.5 million of reserves to balance the budget, to balance the 2010 budget. When 2010 was done, we hadn't touched that 1.5 million, and we had put 200 and some odd thousand additional into reserves. In 2011, at the end of the year, we put, Jennifer, $330,000 into reserves that we ended up in the black.
In which year? I'm sorry.
11. And this year, we will again move 200, well, not move, we will roll over $200,000+ of money that we have not spent, that will in essence go into reserves because it's not programmed anywhere else. So it's difficult just to look at, well, but in the budget, you only put $30,000 in to repay that. True, but between our department heads, between Mrs. Forsberg, between David and myself, we're pretty dang stingy, and we're pretty adamant on we're not spending money unless we need to spend money. And that's the reason that you're having all these miracles on the Washougal, or whatever we call them, at the end of each year, is because we're still saving monies back that are rolling over.
But in order to do that, in March of 2011, you came forward with a supplemental budget request of $638.
So I don't remember what the dollar amount is, but it was healthy.
Yeah. And that took everything you saved the previous year and then some.
And again, I think if you want to look at it in one instance, you could say, yes, you took 600 and some odd thousand dollars out of reserves. That's out of reserves. But if you look at 3 years running, I'm not sure, other than some of the actual expenditures we made for equipment that needed to be replaced, that you aren't pretty close or more in reserves today in total than what we had then.
And
We have more than put that back over 2010, 11, and what we'll contribute back in 2012.
To make part of that point again in a slightly different way, the city, going back to the previous Mayor Guard, has a long tradition of being very, very conservative, read that pessimistic, on their revenue projections, and very, very conservative on their expenditures. We have never spent the expenditures that we projected. We always come in spending less money than we planned, and we always come in with more revenue than we planned because we are so conservative. Put it another way, a budget is frankly a wild-ass guess. You're making a guess as to what your revenues are going to look like after 13 months. You're making another guess as to what your expenditures are going to look like after 13 months. And then you call that a budget. Not only that, the other fiction is that you're doing it on an annual basis, as if there was some great difference between the 31st of December and the 1st of January. That's a fiction that goes back to the 13th century.
We do quarterly updates.
Yes.
And the planning, and I think that's really a great thing to do.
But my point
Also,
is
from our
that,
side, it's mandated to do for you, so.
but my point is that there's a mindset about doing a budget which in many ways is disconnected from reality. You're overly conservative on your revenues, you're overly conservative on your expenditures, and not only that, it's an annual budget. But the city is a perpetuity.
I think of the budget as being the instrument that connects us to reality.
It often is.
Understanding the weaknesses of the system that you talked about.
It often is. Two of the items that we've had under discussion, and Dave, two of them that you asked about, the 76,000 on the fee holiday and the 21,000 for the IT upgrades. Frankly, I don't believe we're gonna spend those out of reserves at all. What we're asking for, and the reason I say that is 2013, we're anticipating will be similar to 2012 in that we're gonna have an ending fund balance. It's gonna be black, it's not gonna be red. For the purpose of the budget, though, you all are mandated by law to pass a balanced budget. And unless we say we're gonna take that 76,000, that 21,000, and we're gonna add it in there for an expense, but we're gonna take it out of revenues as well, that's difficult to do. That's very difficult to do at this point.
Based on the conservative income estimates.
Both the conservative income, quite frankly, it would be easy for us to do. I'll undo everything I just said. It would be easy for us to do if I looked at Jennifer and said, plug in another $100,000 of income somewhere. I don't care where it is, because I know you're gonna come in the black. It's not what I'd prefer to do. I'd prefer to give you a budget that we believe is going to be as accurate as it can be and conservative as it can be. At the end of the year, I don't believe we're gonna be moving any monies from reserves. I believe that we're gonna have it in operating incomes from efficiencies that we've done. Quite frankly, the 21,000, we're prepared to take off the table, because what we'll do, not what we'd prefer to do, we'll purchase software, we'll purchase something, we'll purchase a credit with an IT professionals group of some sort for the upgrades that we'll do for next year, and we'll pay them out of this year's budget. It's legal for us to do. We have the ability in the budget this year because we have capacity in the budget in order to do it. That would take it off the table. That doesn't necessarily mean we're gonna buy exactly the exact version of exactly what we need today that we're gonna implement in the first quarter of 13.
And my question would be, does that solve your operational need?
We may buy A and need B. That would worry me.
You know, I think I need to sit down with you and Dave and maybe Jennifer and go over some of these concerns hearing things I haven't heard before. I don't want to take up everybody's time, but
Except that
I'd like
we
to-
all need to hear it.
Yeah, I think
We
it's
need to hear
very
it.
important for everybody, and
If they wanna
including the public.
go
You-
home,
You
they
certainly
can.
have new members of the council that are not used to going through, and even some things in the budgets that somebody may not get for the
If
first 2
I
or
could
3
add to
years.
that, I just had a 2-hour session with David, Administrator Scott, excuse me, and
First name basis.
Finance Director Farsberg this afternoon spending 2 hours on this, and it was very, very useful for me. We spent a lot of time discussing things I've heard tonight, and it's getting aired all over again, and it puts it in much better context for me.
It's interesting because Joyce and I went and met with Jennifer, you went and met with Jennifer, you went and met with David. Probably a good use of administration would be, let's just have this for months in advance, or however, as soon as it's presented, why don't we, I don't know why we didn't start this discussion out loud.
We've been waiting.
I'm new.
We've been waiting.
I'm like, wait, when do I get to do this? So I just asked, and now we are. I'm glad. Leave it to
Just
the
so
new
you know,
kid
in the
that
future,
says-
the minute we give you these,
Game on.
clock is on.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, and we talked, and it helped us formulate, me as a new person, formulate these questions.
And you need to do
Because
that
I don't even know
again.
what the next step is like he's saying, I'm coming back next week with amendments. I'm thinking, is there something now? I have to do something else. Okay.
It's always a give and take, and I know some
Yeah.
members sometimes will feel like they are, they're opposing the administration on things in the budget. Folks, I don't take this personally at all. The administration, by state law, the administration is charged with proposing a budget, and you have it. We're also charged with bringing forth options, alternatives, and initiatives, and you have some of those. The work is on your all part. We put it together, but the heavy lifting is by the council itself in deciding what is most important to do as a community. We'll bring things forward. We're always welcome to hear things from council members to bring forward as well. In addition, we're not the only ones that could bring forth
Right.
initiatives. You can as well, and you're encouraged to. But that's what we're charged with doing, not with just sitting here and going, okay, whatever they're gonna do, okay, we'll just take it.
Well, in the Open Public Meeting Act, it restricts us. That's why I think we need to just, from now on, now I know, okay, you guys get ready for lots of conversations through November. When did we get this? October? But we can't, just 3 of us can talk, but all of us can't, so now's the time. So,
The meetings and workshops, most definitely.
I just wanted to underline your point about, the budget comes out. I mean, this is my 6th budget, and I got to tell you, I've been through every page of the budget 3 times, and I'm only beginning to understand and to have questions. It takes some time. You can't get the budget and, oh yeah, now I understand it.
but I love the conversation because your question spurs conversation.
Exactly.
And then we chew on it and we say, yeah, I
I-
like that, no, I don't like that.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree or I disagree.
I agree, and especially, the sooner we can get a budget, it takes a couple of weeks at least to get some sense of what's there and what you want to talk about. And so, yeah, it's not, I agree with you, it takes a while.
So then by law, do we have to have this passed Monday?
No.
By December 31.
Okay. We were planning to pass it Monday.
No, Monday, in our minds, Monday is your first opportunity to pass
Oh, I
it.
thought it was I thought we had said we're going to pass it on Monday.
No, it's property tax.
Okay, that
that
helps.
has to be done, yeah.
We would never presume to tell you when you're gonna pass anything, especially
I'm so
the
used to
budget.
being told what to do, I just,
We will
No,
have
I'm
an
kidding.
we will
I'm
have an
kidding.
ordinance for you next week.
For consideration.
So that you could pass it if you choose to.
okay.
That would be the first time that was in front of you, is next week.
And our calendar, I don't have, I left my phone at home. Oh, I have this. We're not meeting Christmas
Christmas Eve.
Eve, and so we are meeting, I got a calendar now.
You have a workshop on,
November.
you have your meeting on the 3rd, regular meeting.
Meeting
You have
on
a
the 3rd.
workshop on the 10th. You have a regular meeting on the 17th, and that is the last scheduled meeting of the council in 2012. And so we would anticipate that if you're unable to pass the budget next week, that you would be able to take that action on the 17th, and that would be desirous. But if you're not able to do that, we will call a special meeting. You have to act by December 31st, but you'd have to come back in special meeting if you don't pass it on the 17th.
So if we don't pass it by the 17th, we're going to pass it on Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve.
No.
Could be any day of the
I'll-
week.
Special meeting.
I doubt when I call a special meeting, it's going to be on one of those 2 evenings. It might be on a Sunday rather than on that Monday,
Would be
but.
kind of fun, though.
Only if you wear a Santa hat.
David, you had a question?
Well, a comment, first of all, I wanted to thank everybody for, and especially you, because I understand the pressure to get the budget done, for delaying this a week and giving us a chance to chew it over. The other thing I wanted to do was step in Joyce's defense down there. I understand how you feel. It took a while for me to understand your comment about not keeping money in reserve and returning it to the taxpayers. And that's a good philosophy. There needs to be something in reserve for emergencies like the storms and the fires and the earthquakes and all that stuff. But it's except for that, it's very much like artillery in the Army. You don't keep artillery in reserve. That's your firepower. You put it in action, you use it. If you need to move it to another location, you do that. Like we're talking about with moving funds around tonight. But you don't ever keep artillery in reserve. So I understand your philosophy. I come from the background in which they don't do that. On the other hand, I saw the Army get into some pretty bad scrapes by using that philosophy.
No, I believe in a reserve. I believe there has to be enough money there to provide for what needs to be provided for, the 16%, or whatever that number is chosen. But I think you don't keep money for the sake of keeping money. It should be allocated and be used for the community, in my mind. It should be working. The money should be working for the community.
And I agree with that, with the caveat that you need enough to take care of that unexpected event that comes up.
That's why I was saying maybe we need to have conversation among the 7 of us
I think that would be healthy.
to
But I
make
want
a
you to
new
know
benchmark.
that your comment improved and changed my perspective broadened my perspective on the reserves.
I agree with that. I remember back in some political history, Proposition 13 in California, Initiative 695 here in Washington, when funds were starting to build up so much that the reserves just got excessive. And I think there's some question about that with C-Tran. They just get so high, and the agency doesn't want to give it up, and so the voters revolted in 1978 with Proposition 13 in California, in 1999 with I-695 in Washington. And I think at some point it gets excessive. Now, one of the questions I had, evidently we've changed some of our accounting practices of what we're considering reserves. I'd like to have an apples to apples comparison from prior years of what, I'd like to look at all the funds that we have in our budget that could arguably be called a reserve, and I'd like to know what that figure is. And that would include the $500,000 we have here, which I think could still arguably be considered a reserve.
Right, and I think Connie Jo has asked that same question. I
I
think we're
just
trying
got
to do
it
some
in
research.
an email today.
Oh, you did get it?
I got it.
Oh, I didn't get copied on that.
I
Oh,
haven't-
I was interested to see too, but I'm sure I will before tonight's over.
In fact, it
So
probably
let's
could,
go ahead and make that available
out to everybody.
Jennifer, did that go through the 2012 budget, what we've moved?
It included the proposed 13 budget.
Oh, so it went up through and included 13?
I requested
Okay,
10
so-
years.
So let's make sure that we get all
Well,
of that.
and maybe this question's been answered, I'm about to ask too, but historically, I was intrigued to hear that, we've had just had the greatest recession, and may not be over yet, We've just had the greatest recession since the Great Depression, and we still did not exhaust our, we still did not go out of our budget. We still didn't, we had enough money to meet our expenses. Is that true? Without hitting reserves?
No, that's absolutely correct. There was, I don't have that spreadsheet pulled up. Earlier in this century, there was a dipping into reserves very nominally.
2006.
2006.
163,000.
We weren't even in a recession then.
Not yet.
And so that may have been programmed one time, potentially. I'm not sure if it was programmed one time, strategic use of reserve. As the mayor mentioned, to balance the 2010 budget in the heat and right in the middle of that Great Recession.
And on the 27th of December.
The council passed a budget that programmed $1.5 million of reserves just for operating, just regular O&M to keep the city going. Many communities across the nation and your own employer programmed reserves over several years during that time frame modestly to not experience draconian cuts, even though there were significant cuts.
How about Clark County? They went through some pretty massive.
Clark County went through some very serious cuts as well. Vancouver and Clark County both primarily in the area of parks and recreation and in the development review services area because the business wasn't there anymore. And they had staffed up to have enough inspectors, for example, to serve. And just like in the construction industry, when that goes down, then that staffing goes down. A smaller community, like here in Washougal, that was weathered better. So I think the history of reserves here is relatively short, as we've been educated this evening, and it's been healthier than I think the norm. There's been some strategic identification and use of those funds according to some best practice. And I think it's an excellent discussion for the council to land on what their policy is for what you want that reserve level to be. And the catalyst right now for that has been an additional proposal this year for some use of those unrestricted reserves.
Just higher than Vallejo and Stockton.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'll check. I did, just as an interesting anecdote, I don't have it right in front of me, but just doing some research over the last week or so, trying to get a feel for this. The literature's, I don't want to say it's all over the board, but the literature is interesting on about the 16% and why it's there. We talk a lot about the fact that, we get our income in a couple chunks and how we're going to pay our bills. A lot of the literature talks about that 16% being for contingencies. So it's very interesting, and I could forward some of those articles, but this is a couple years old, but the Washington City's median reserve level for AA3 rated cities, their bond rating, was 22.7%.
What are we rated?
We're rated higher than that.
Okay.
And it's not just because of our healthy reserve levels, it's because of all of our financial practices. We should be very proud of that as a community. So 22.7%, I just saw that anecdotally on a piece, an AA3 city, that was the average. We're currently we are proposing at the end of 2013 to be at 26%, which would still be north of that 22.7. And again, there's no magic to that. That's just an anecdotal piece of evidence that was the average that Moody's found for the communities that it rated as an AA3. I have found in the literature, recent literature, mostly out of the East Coast, where much lower reserves are what are identified by the rating agencies as adequate to kind of pass muster with them and get healthy ratings. I saw 5%, I saw 8%. I don't think that's prudent. In our associations, the ICMA, International City Managers Association, and our own AWC, Association of Washington Cities, kind of a 1 to 3 month, which would be anywhere from 8 to 25%. We're right in the middle. I think a lot of folks are at 16%. So it's really across the board. It really is just a question of policy for the council. I believe the proposed budget maintains a 26% reserve all told, plus those other funds that are
Plus
there.
the other funds that,
Right.
again, the
That
staff,
would be converted to reserves if we had to.
in my mind, are reserves.
Right.
We've identified a use for them, but short of them being expended, they're available to you for other items out there that are unallocated as well.
You got a comment on that?
You bet.
Here's my concern about that. You've got 27%. 16% of that is in unrestricted reserve, or is in restricted reserves, which is dedicated primarily to cash flow, not to emergencies, as I understand it. And then the other 11% are for emergencies. And these other funds, there's no guarantee that they'll be available. They are now. But you could spend those throughout the year, and then there's no guarantee they're available.
We can't spend them without coming back to you as a council for authorization to spend them unless they're included in the current year budget.
I agree. And
Coming
my
out of
colleagues have been
those-
very generous in their response to those
Coming out of
requests.
those individual ones, any of those expenditures that may be programmed for 2013 are in the booklets in those funds that you have today.
Yeah, but there's always a possibility of a supplemental, what I call the March surprise.
But again, that's something that we would have to come back to you. I believe the only thing I could spend money on, other than what you've allowed me to spend money on, is in the case of a disaster. I believe I have the ability to write some amount of checks until you all have the next opportunity to come back and literally validate those checks I already wrote because they're gone.
I would hope so. But the council has a history of being very generous with such requests. And so I'm not sure that these funds will be there to use as a reserve. And I realize that we have a different philosophy on that.
Yeah, I won't even say that I completely understand what you've said, because I don't believe there's any rush, and I don't believe this administration has ever proved that there's any rush to go out and spend monies once they've been allocated. We've certainly never done it. Even though we've programmed fleet replacements for some of the vehicles, we've even questioned some of those vehicles' replacement. And do we really need that? We know the money's there. We can go out and do it as long as the council approves it. But do we really need that for that, or could we do this, or could we move this vehicle over here to do this? Or I would say the last thing that we do in that exercise is decide to spend the money. We try and find a lot of things to do prior to that. But again, that's why you have fund balances in those funds.
Sure.
And they have not been spent.
Yet.
I don't know whether this is Jennifer or David. Our money we see our money, does it come in yearly, monthly? I mean, the sales tax come in quarterly? Does the property tax come in yearly? How does our money come into the city? What's, in the time frame?
The sales tax and REITs and those come in monthly. And then the property taxes come in, they come in monthly in small increments, and then in April and October are the big payments for property taxes. But everything else pretty much comes in monthly. Excise taxes, liquor excise taxes are quarterly. Liquor profits are quarterly. But like business licenses, obviously, community development fees come in when they come in. And sales tax is monthly, hotel motels monthly.
So we have a cash flow that's coming in regularly? or
Correct.
monthly?
We have
It's-
cash that comes in regularly.
yeah.
Our biggest chunk, remember that.
The
our
biggest chunk, the property
taxes are
taxes.
3 million, 3 point something in property tax.
All of them together are just under 4, I believe, for 12.
So you've got half, a third to a half of it, that the biggest chunks come in two parts of the calendar and not on a monthly basis. Not as quickly as we expended for some of them. Paul?
I just wanted to say, I respect your experience with organizations that spend the money. When I was in ROTC, we had maneuvers, and there was blank ammunition that was to be used. And the last platoon through the course, rather than 250 rounds for the machine gun, we had 1,500. Because if we didn't use it, we wouldn't get it next year. Because that's the way the Army worked. This city has never worked that way. Never. Like I said, with the Public Works budget, if we didn't have the storms, we didn't spend the money. That's not how that would have worked in some other organizations. Another example of that was Vancouver, Clark County, Camas, all did significant layoffs in 2009 or 10. This city was so lean that we didn't have to lay off anyone. We have been so frugal in this city going back for many years that we, even when times were tough, there were some vacancies we didn't fill, but we didn't have to lay anyone off. Everyone else did, because we were so tight-fisted when the money was rolling in that we could kind of level things out from the peaks and valleys of the overall economy.
And I applaud that, and I'd like to see it continue.
Jennifer?
I wanted to ask a couple of specific questions regarding one of the funds, that Low-Income Assistance Agency Fund. I guess I just want to question the legality and, why is this not considered a subsidy?
The gift of public funds issue. The Constitution allows, the state constitution allows governments to give funds to the poor and infirmed. So
Okay, that leads to my next question. It says assist low income. Okay, I get that part. What are the criteria? How are we to determine that they are low income? We give money to agencies that set those determinations, East County Family Resource, so on. How are we going to do this internally?
we're going to piggyback on Clark Public Utilities program, and they have infrastructure to take care of that and to make those determinations and ensure that folks that truly have need, according to those standards, would be the ones that we would be working with. And they already qualify through that program, and so then if they're qualified through that program, then they would qualify for us. So we don't have the resources to basically take that on ourselves.
That's what I thought.
And to further answer your question, I believe Operation Warm Heart, which is one that CPU does, has been in place, it's been in place a long time, and was challenged through the courts 15 years ago. It was Operation Warm Heart, and their appliance repair program was on the same challenge. And Operation Warm Heart was upheld. The appliance one was kind of, sort of, not really, and doesn't exist anymore. So I believe it's one that's also been challenged and successfully stayed in operation as a legitimate expense by that agency.
Okay, so you feel pretty confident that, we're going to be piggybacking on CPU program, and, the residences or citizens that are going to qualify for this have already been pre-qualified? Is that what you're saying?
Well, we haven't unrolled the program yet because we haven't established it, but once we do, we are absolutely going to vet those that would receive assistance through that Clark program and not do it ourselves, so that we make sure that it's appropriate.
And we're mirroring Vancouver's program. Do they go through CPU as well? Okay.
I don't know.
Megan's been working on that, and we are mirroring it off of the Vancouver program. And we're currently in discussions with the PUD. That's why we haven't brought anything forward yet, because we want to get that solidified and have the full package to bring forward on what we'd like to present but we want to make sure that the fund is set up and available to go once we have the program criteria in place.
The real question for the council, is the question of, should we seed that fund
Right. See,
initially?
I'm definitely in favor of, opening the fund and having citizens donate to the fund, neighbor helping neighbor, that sort of thing. I just question the seeding of the fund by the city, because the funds are essentially coming right back to the city to pay bills. So it's just kind of odd.
Late fees, right? That's where it's.
Late fees and reconnection fees.
The funds would come from the ending fund balance in the utility funds. However, for the purposes of finding a number, we identified approximately 1 year's worth of late fee. So that we identified what do we take in an average year in late fees, and said, okay, let's use those. The reason maybe that there are some of those late fees is because of the issue that we're trying to address. Is that an appropriate seeding amount? And there's no right or wrong to that. It's just a question of the council's perspective on the appropriateness of using those funds to seed the program and at what level to seed it. We could rely solely on the philanthropy of neighbor helping neighbor, and it'll just take a little while in that regard to get the program up and running. It'll take some time to get some momentum so that we could be able to provide some assistance. So the thought here, the proposal is to kickstart it. It is legitimate and it is, legal. It's just a question, is that something the council thinks is appropriate to do?
Interesting. Are there any other council members willing to give thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have some questions to help
So I'd like
clarify.
to have a discussion.
You just answered 2 or 3 of my questions, just in that little tiny dissertation. So you amaze me. You really, I say that joke almost tongue in cheek, but you understand things so beautifully. I love the way you get it and you can convey what we need to know. I appreciate that. Now, the 95,000 is approximately 1 year late fees. Are those late fees from people that are distressed financially, or are those is that $95,000 figure from people like, oh, I was on vacation, I forgot to pay my bill?
Yes and yes.
Yes.
Is it mostly from people that are already distressed?
I don't think we're
Because-
gonna put anybody in a position to say who comes to our counter that's destitute versus who's not managing their funds well, that can otherwise
Well,
legitimately
it's back to a
afford it.
philosophy of, if we're already, we're dinging people that are financially distraught, then that finance could easily and morally be, put in a fund to seed it. If I'm struggling with, should we seed it with money already in the city's coffers, or should we go to the neighbors and ask? I tended in the beginning to say, let's start with the community and ask them, go to the community with an ask, start using that, build it up, give it out as it comes in.
Just as a side note, we do work with folks when they come in, and if they make a payment arrangement before they get shut off or before their payment is due, then we do waive the late
Waive the
fees.
late
So
fees.
it is truly a combination of both sides of the spectrum, but we do have, we do work with people. I guess I just wanted to
Right.
put that out there, that we're not, we truly are trying to help folks that are in that